Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, here we go on another podcast where I get to meet an accessibility practitioner. And today I'm pleased to be meeting with Jen Devins. Hello, Jen. How are you today?
Hi, Joe. I'm doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on here.
Well, I'm speaking from my home office on Vashon Island, which is near Blink's headquarters office in Seattle. Where are you talking to us from today?
Today, I'm actually talking to you from Boulder, Colorado. I recently transitioned out here, still working at Google, but we have an office out here, and we decided to pick up and move about a year ago to be out here.
All right. Well, yeah, I mean, you kind of understand Google has a presence all over, but I didn't realize there was a space in Boulder. But that must be a nice place to decide to live.
Yes, yeah, we've been very happy. We miss the ocean a little bit in California, but it's been good out here.
Well, you mentioned the Google relationship. Why don't we start with you just briefly talking about what you're doing today?
Yes, yeah. So it's been about, I think, 7 years now. I've been in this role where I lead the user experience team for Google's central accessibility organization. And our remit is essentially we have kind of two key focus areas. And so one is we have researchers and designers, and we actually partner with our engineers and product managers to create new applications or assistive technologies specifically for people with disabilities. And then the other area that we focus on is providing infrastructure, guidelines, all kinds of tools that can help teams across Google ensure that their products are more accessible. So we do a lot of collaboration and consulting across the teams at Google. So it's quite a wide range of things, but it's been really fun.
Well, yeah, that sounds like quite a lot of responsibility things going on, and we can dig more into that a little bit later. But one of the things that is a main objective of this podcast is just to find out how people made their way to where they are today, what their journey was into accessibility. So, why don't you just kind of go back in time, let me know, where that first came on the radar for you, and we can kind of move our way back up to today.
Yeah, I agree. It's always interesting to hear how people got where they got, and I personally feel like in user experience, for sure, the paths to it vary quite a bit. Mine was actually a little bit more straightforward, I think, than most. But I started in the arts. My undergrad was graphic design. As a kid, I always just really appreciated and was into art. And so I did really focus on industrial arts and graphic design as undergrad. And then and I started in San Diego, and I actually moved up to San Francisco to kind of finish off my undergraduate. And in that environment, I started getting into just understanding the world of educational technology. And I really liked that space of kind of combining, some of the arts that I was learning of just how to communicate and convey information, but doing it from the perspective of educating people. Or in this aspect, it was actually more for adults versus kids. And so that was an area that really piqued my interest. I finished off and just finishing out my industrial arts bachelor's, but then after that, I decided to go and get a master's focusing in the educational technology realm. Where that took me, though, was back to Illinois. So I was actually born, I was born in St. Louis, but raised in Illinois most of my life. So I went back to Illinois to get a master's from the University of Illinois. And I focused on education with the emphasis of instructional technology. So still kind of bringing that idea of, again, how to convey information from with the perspective of training or educating people, and I really liked that. So that was kind of where I kind of wrapped up my education, and then decided, based on just the opportunities and stuff, to move back to the West Coast. And there I did explore a little bit of getting into academia, but I ended up taking more of the route of just getting into industry. And I started, honestly, it's kind of dating myself, as truly just like an old school webmaster. So just creating web applications for certain businesses. And through that, though, just being in the Silicon Valley area, I was able to make some connections, and eventually became an official user experience, or actually back then we were called just more interaction designers. And I started working at eBay as an interaction designer and a researcher. And I was very, very fortunate to have had somebody in that space that recognized, like, that they saw something in me I don't think everybody saw in the interviews, because I don't think they actually went great. But there was one person who is still a friend today, Kelly Braun, that I think she recognized something in me, and was brought me on as a researcher initially in eBay. And so I was really focusing on the users and understanding their needs. And then eventually, just with my background in design, I kind of pivoted and stayed more within the design field. So I was there, just kind of doing my interaction design role. And from there, just as things were moving and shaking, I decided to move to Google back in 2005. So I've been there quite some time. And throughout that experience, it was great. Because it is a big company that focuses on a lot of different things, I was able to kind of go and work on different products, which is kind of almost like working in different companies. Like, just the users were different, the teams obviously were different, the goals, even the types of design we needed to do was very different. So that was really enjoyable. And then I was starting to get into design management, and so that's kind of where I was. And there just kind of came.
I mean,
Oh
just
yeah, sorry.
just to kind of check into to where you came from so far. There, you kind of touched a lot of spots that other people have, found their way into accessibility. Except you touched a lot of them, which is education and training is often a way that people come in.
Yeah.
Sometimes exploring academia, which you looked at, the user experience area of design, but then you also were involved in research. You were involved as working with web technologies early on. So you kind of actually had all these foundational elements that a lot of people had already, and so it looks like that was setting you up for whatever this next chapter is that you're going to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good summarization. And yes, because I really appreciated and felt kind of honored to be a user experience designer. And I just, our kind of, or at least my mantra was always, I am the voice of the user. And I took that to heart, and in all of my work. And, as just life goes on, my my parents were getting older. My dad ended up having dementia. I started losing some of my hearing, and just, life starts happening, and you start to realize that a lot of the technology we were trying to use just kept getting harder to use in some areas and aspects for people. And that just really kind of, it just shifted my thinking a little bit and made me realize, like, while I kept feeling like I'm the champion of the users, I was realizing, wait a minute, I'm not the champion of all users here. I'm just like thinking of kind of, yes, just maybe like the kind of prototypical user, and not really thinking about the needs of everybody. And that all kind of came around the time where I myself in my career, I was just, I was satisfied, but I was kind of like, I don't know what's next. It was fine being a design manager. I just returned after having children and wasn't sure exactly where to take this. And so I was fortunate in that there was just a need for somebody in, at that point in time at Google. I was working in the, what is now called workspace. So where Gmail and Calendar, all that, those products live. I was in that space, and they needed somebody to start, from a UX perspective, thinking about accessibility. So I decided to try that role out, and brought with that, just the things that I've been observing, like with my parents and myself, even just, and the challenges there. And so really then just pushing on, okay, this was my entry point to here and my understanding, and it drove, like a passion within me. Now, how do I get the rest of everybody to, kind of have that same passion? Because it is work, and it is a new way, to think for a lot of people, and just, new things to consider. And so that's where kind of my journey started on, and I wasn't alone by any means. There were other people in the company thinking about this, but, I kind of felt like the starting point was how, like, people, that were designing and creating our products, they needed to understand the experience other people were having. Like, yes, they might understand their own experience of using, even just Gmail, for example, but what is the experience of somebody that's blind using this, and just, so I really started pushing hard on, let's do research, let's bring users in, and get, an understanding of those experiences. And that's kind of where it started.
Well, so as you came into that role, yeah, I imagine there must have been a lot that you had to learn about and figure out relative to accessibility. So, did that come from a some kind of formal network of accessibility education within Google, or colleagues, or how did you approach that part of it?
Yeah, that is a great question. It was a mixture of things. Again, I was very fortunate, to the to have a few colleagues. One, engineering had been thinking about accessibility, at that point in time to some degree. So I had some engineers to kind of just learn the basics around web technology or web accessibility, and try to dig into that. And there's obviously great external resources as well, from like WebAIM and stuff. So I really dug into that to just understand, how does it work? Like, how do you support it from a technical, perspective? Because again, just, outside of accessibility, as UX designer, I always felt it's important to understand how the technology works, like the designs you want to get to, like, what does it require? So I dug into that. And then I also was really fortunate that, in our area, we had a few folks that were, more on the program management side, that had disabilities that I worked with, and they were focused on accessibility as well. So it was kind of getting they had expertise in using assistive technologies, but also just, them as end users, and being able to kind of talk with them, and on a regular basis, and just kind of observe and see what their experiences are. And that's only a few people, but that was a great place to start, and then expand out and just obviously look at, or interact with and reach out to other people.
And then you started talking about how how you started developing the program for the work that you're directly involved in. So what was that like? What were some of your priorities, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, it, like I said, I really started on, understanding the user and doing research, in order to kind of bring that back to the teams and convert that into training as well. So, I would say education, awareness, getting into the empathy realm. That's where I started, just to kind of gain some traction, get some interest, and, like I said, make people aware. I think that's where I felt like we needed to start, and that was useful, and, took us to a certain level. But, I think quickly after that, you realize okay, all of these teams that we're asking to do this, they're aware. And of course, nobody was saying like, no, that we don't agree. I think everybody agreed, like, yes, this is important. But then it came to the very specifics of how do we actually do this. And so that's where we would dig in more. Like I said, engineering was already kind of getting into this realm of how do you, just build in the support within your applications. But on the design side, what are some things that we as designers can be thinking about early on as we're even just sketching? So really just trying to break that down to like just processes that people can follow. So that was a key thing. And then, in any large organization, I think the other thing that was very evident and something, we're always going to be working with is the competing priorities that any sort of product team has. And so this is where we definitely realize, like, okay, we need more leadership support in this, and to prioritize this type of work. Because as I mentioned, it is work. We try really hard to essentially like bake in the these processes of how to think about people with disabilities throughout your design process and your engineering process. And we try to really bake it in so it does feel like this is just the standard process. But it takes work, and it takes, especially when you're ramping up learning. So it does take that time. And we needed people to be on board to say, like, it's okay if it takes a little extra time to launch XYZ. And so that's where it started quickly. We started to see like the I would say multi-prong approach of trying to get the leadership buy-in so they would prioritize this work on behalf of the teams and just note how important it is, and then giving the people that are actually building these products the tools and processes to help do it. So we're still in the thick of that. We'll always be really focused on that, but it's been exciting to see just in the past I guess it's 7 years or so that I've been in this. The conversations have changed, which is great, and it's a little bit more of like, okay, they're getting more nuanced. It's like they're getting past the basics and like, okay, now how do I tackle this tricky problems, which is it's just great.
Is your organization set up with accessibility where you're involved with onboarding or spreading information across the whole organization, or is it set up where individual product groups within Google are responsible for going after their own resources and finding their way?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a mixed approach. So as I mentioned, we're on the central accessibility team, and as for the company. And so as in that role, we are responsible and taking part in much of the creation of the tooling and those resources. But what we have is kind of a hub and spoke model. So across the larger teams or organizations across the company, they also have their own accessibility teams where they are obviously much more aware of their specific product needs and the users and all that. And so they are also responsible for their own work. And, I think together I would say as Google's overall accessibility program, we do try to collaborate and help each other out when it comes to trying to get resourcing and things like that. We work together where we can on that. But it is definitely like each of these kind of larger organizations have their own smaller accessibility teams that are more focused on their own products and their own establishing kind of their own accessibility program that fits with how that team works.
Well, I'm always trying to look ahead a little bit. I kind of look in the past and see where we've come. I'm not always feeling like we came as far as I thought we would have when I first started working on this 20 years ago. But then there's also amazing things that have happened, with voice interaction that, that's been so valuable, and technology playing a big role. As you look forward, are there any areas where you see gaps that you think accessibility needs to be attentive to, or are there any particular things that you're really passionate about looking forward that you're excited, about either at Google or just generally for your accessibility work?
Yeah. And I agree. I have the same perspective. There's some there's some parts where like, really, we're still talking about this, and then there's some great advancements and exciting projects. And yeah, I think in general, I'm excited about in the UX community and just in general. I think we talk a lot about an adaptive design approach. And in our team, we've recently been talking a lot about ability-based design, which I think kind of go hand in hand, because the idea at a very high level is that it's less on the onus of the user to have to tweak a bunch of settings and stuff to make the experience to their that supports them. It's more kind of the onus becomes more part of the application or the product that learns how the user interacts and can adapt to them. And with that approach, I feel like it's exciting because it gets it really focuses, I think, on the creativity of how do we solve these problems, and from an engineering perspective as well as design problem, like how can we more seamlessly meet the needs of different users. And I wouldn't say it steps away, it just goes beyond the kind of feeling of like, oh, I just have my checklist of guidelines, I make sure my contrast is good. I think people get that, but it's not very inspiring, right? And so I think just focusing on how do we make our products more understanding and adaptive of different people's needs and the way they interact, to me seems really exciting. And with that, just it is great to see the different modalities of how we interact with products, like you mentioned, a lot of the voice interactive products that we have, I think are really exciting. I think there's a long ways to go to be really inclusive of that and understand everybody's speech patterns, and I think there's a lot there, but it is great to see, again, just like these different modalities that people can interact with products. And now, in my perspective, it's okay, we have these different ways, and right now, for the most part, they're maybe kind of siloed. It's like you interact with this device with your voice, you interact with this device by touch screen. But how do we kind of bring that together and have a truly kind of multimodal experience for users, so that even throughout completing one task, you can switch seamlessly between using touch and voice and and eyes. I think there's a lot there that, to me, we are just in general, I'm excited to push on that more, because I do feel like when speaking about accessibility, I want to push people to think beyond compliance, right? And just say, like, no, thinking this way can actually make us more innovative and really solve and address a lot of these problems with people. So,
Well, Jen, it's been great to have this chance to follow your journey here to what you're doing with accessibility today. And I hope everything continues to go well, and maybe we can meet up in the real world sometime when that's possible again.
that would be lovely. Yeah, I can't wait for that day. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.